I was 55 when a woman I had just met said, I have two kids. If you want to live, do it now. I want to try to stop you. She didn't raise her voice and she didn't soften it either. She said in the way people do when they already learn the honest scars of the wrong honest, faster than excuses ever could. And in that exact second, I felt something familiar kick in an old instinct, sharp and automatic.
The one that tells you where the exit is before anyone finishes the sentence. I knew exactly how to stand up, say something decent, and be gone without making a mess. I'd done it most of my adult life. What I didn't expect was how tired I was of knowing how to leave. A few hours earlier, I'd been sitting alone in a cheap roadside motel in North Carolina, the kind right off the highway with thin walls and a flickering TV. Pizza box open on the bed. Remote in my hand. I kept flipping channels until I landed on an old sitcom I'd seen so many times I didn't even need to watch it. That was my rhythm on work trips. Eat. Watch. Sleep. Repeat. No one asking where I was. No one disappointed if I stayed quiet. I used to tell myself that was peace. Somewhere along the way, I started to suspect it was just rehearsal. Practice at disappearing. I was in town for a short consulting job, warehouse security, temporary contract, nothing that required me to unpack more than a suitcase. Temporary suited me. It always had. My marriage hadn't ended in a dramatic way. No shouting matches, no broken furniture. We just stopped believing we could fix what we kept postponing. I missed my son's games. Promised I'd be there, then took another contract instead. I always had a reason that sounded responsible. I told myself I'd show up later, when things slowed down. They never did. Later has a way of turning into never if you keep feeding it excuses. That night, a colleague texted me and said he'd sign me up for something called Second Chance Supper. A dinner for people over 45. I stared at the message, already building the explanation in my head: long day, early start, rain check. Those sentences came easily to me. They were well worn. But the silence in that motel room felt heavier than usual. So I put my jacket on and went, half annoyed at myself for even caring. The restaurant was small and a little too bright. A few tables pushed together. Name tags written in thick marker. People smiling the careful smiles of adults who had lived enough to know better than to expect miracles. I sat down with two men whose names I immediately forgot and an empty chair across from me. When she walked in late, apologizing as she shrugged off her jacket, I noticed how tired she looked. Not exhausted in a dramatic way. Just worn down from being needed all day. She said her name was Susan. She worked at a family clinic. Someone had needed more time than expected. That seemed to be a pattern in her life. We talked about music from when life felt louder. Springsteen. Waiting by the radio with a cassette ready, hoping the DJ wouldn't talk over the first few seconds. It felt easy, and that should have made me nervous. Easy conversations have a way of asking for more if you let them continue. Eventually, the table drifted toward the subject everyone pretends isn't coming: family. That's when she said it. No pause. No apology. 2 kids. Teenagers. No interest in something casual. If I wanted to leave, now was the time. I felt my body react before my thoughts caught up. 2 teenagers meant schedules, moods, doors slammed for reasons you might never understand. It meant expectations. It meant the risk of disappointing more than one person at a time. I'd already failed at that once. I could feel the old logic lining up fast: stand up, say the right thing, don't complicate her life. The room around us was moving. Plates cleared. Chairs scraped back. And I stayed seated, staring at the table like it was holding me in place. She added, quieter this time, that she carried a lot of baggage. That she wouldn't blame me for deciding it wasn't for me. She wasn't challenging me. She was giving me permission. And that permission hit harder than pressure ever had. Because I realized how often I'd needed someone to say that before I took the exit. How many times I'd convinced myself leaving was the mature choice when it was really just the familiar one. In my head, I was already rehearsing the lines. You deserve someone more available. It's not the right time. I don't want to complicate things. They all sound kind. They even sound wise. They all end the same way, with me alone and telling myself it was inevitable. I felt a strange mix of panic and irritation then, not at her, but at myself. I didn't fully trust my own instincts anymore. They'd led me away from too many rooms I should have stayed in. The waiter came by to ask about dessert. Without thinking it through, without planning anything ahead, I asked him to refill our coffee instead. The words came out before I could polish them. I looked at Susan and said, "Then let's at least finish this cup." My voice didn't sound confident. It sounded unsure, almost reckless. And that scared me more than leaving ever had. I didn't know what staying would cost me yet. I just knew that walking out would cost me something I'd already paid too many times. And for the first time in a long while, staying didn't feel noble or brave. It felt dangerous. And I stayed anyway. I was sitting in my pickup with the engine off, phone in my hand, staring at a message I'd already read too many times. You seem to put more effort into new people than you ever did into us. My son had sent it 3 days earlier. I still hadn't answered. Not because I didn't care. Because I didn't know how to respond without admitting he might be right. And there I was, parked outside a coffee shop, about to walk in and see Susan again. Already making a choice before the day had properly started. If I'm honest, that message unsettled me more than anything she'd said at dinner. I stayed in the truck longer than necessary. Watched people move in and out. A man my age arguing quietly with his wife by the passenger door. Another guy loading groceries into the back of an SUV, moving fast like he was late for something important. Normal life. The kind that doesn't pause while you figure yourself out. I thought about driving away. Not because I didn't want to see Susan. But because I was starting to recognize a familiar pattern. Every time something new entered my life, something old seemed to get neglected. When I finally went inside, she was already there. Sitting by the window, coat still on, hands wrapped around a paper cup like it was the only warm thing she'd touched all morning. No makeup. Hair pulled back. A clinic badge clipped to her bag. She looked more tired than she had the other night, but also less guarded. Like she wasn't trying to present a version of herself anymore. That mattered. We talked about small things at first. Traffic. The coffee. How loud the espresso machine was. The usual warm-up people use to avoid stepping straight into the heavier stuff. Then she started talking about work. Coordinating schedules at a family clinic. Insurance calls. Patients who needed more time than the system allowed. She said some days she felt like a switchboard for other people's emergencies. Always redirecting. Always holding together problems that weren't hers to fix. I listened, recognizing that exhaustion. I'd lived beside it once. I just hadn't stayed. She told me about her kids. A son in high school who'd started skipping classes, pushing boundaries like he was testing how much room the world would give him. A daughter in college who rarely answered calls and insisted everything was fine, which somehow worried her more. She spoke without anger. Just concern layered with fatigue. Then she mentioned her ex-husband, Tom. No bitterness. No villain story. Just honesty. He didn't fail us, she said. He just left when it got too heavy. I'm afraid of that happening again. That sentence landed hard. Not because it accused me. Because it described me better than I was comfortable admitting. I didn't say that out loud. Instead, I told her about a basketball game I'd promised my son I'd attend years ago. A big one. I remembered packing for a job out of state the night before, convincing myself I'd call him afterward. He scored the winning shot. I found out through a photo someone else sent me. That was the moment something shifted between us. Not anger. Distance. The kind that settles in quietly and doesn't ask permission. Susan didn't interrupt. She didn't rush to reassure me. She just listened. That silence did more than sympathy ever could have. It felt like we were sitting inside the same mistake from different sides. And that's when the question I'd been circling finally sharpened. Not whether I liked her. Not whether I wanted to see her again. But whether I had any right stepping into a family when I still hadn't fully faced my own. My phone sat on the table between us. I kept glancing at it without touching it. The message still unanswered. A small thing. Heavy in a way I couldn't ignore. Inside my head, the arguments lined up fast. I'm 55. I get tired more easily. I've already failed once. What if I become another adult who promises presence and delivers absence? What if staying here means widening the gap between me and my son even further? I didn't like any of the answers forming. Susan noticed my distraction. She didn't ask what it was. Just said, quietly, if this ever feels like too much, we don't have to force it into something heavy. Coffee. Conversation. That can be enough. She was offering me a softer version of staying. Familiar ground. Close enough to feel connected. Far enough to avoid responsibility. I'd lived there before. It never ended well. We stepped outside together. A light drizzle had started, the kind that doesn't commit. We stood under the awning, close but not touching. She said she wouldn't ask me to stay. That she'd learned not to do that. Honesty mattered more to her than optimism. I could have agreed. I could have walked away clean. No promises broken. No damage done yet. My phone buzzed. Another message from my son. Short. Direct. Are you around tonight? I stared at the screen longer than I should have. I knew if I answered honestly, I'd have to choose. There was no version where everyone stayed comfortable. I felt the old instinct flare again. Delay. Deflect. Buy time. I didn't. Instead, I turned the phone face down. Not to ignore him, but because I knew what I was about to say would matter. I looked at Susan and said, I don't want this to be something I disappear from later. If we do this, even slowly, I need to know I'm not just visiting your life. She didn't answer right away. That pause told me I'd crossed from safe ground into something real. Her expression changed, not fear, not relief, but caution. I can't promise my life will get easier, she said. And I won't protect you from it if it doesn't. That was the first time she sounded like a risk instead of a refuge. We stood there a moment longer, rain tapping lightly on the pavement. Then she said she had to go pick up her son. She hugged herself against the cold and walked toward her car without looking back. No reassurance. No plan set. Just distance. I sat back in my truck and finally opened my phone. I typed a reply to my son, erased it, typed again. In the end, I sent the truth. I'm in town. I can come by tonight if you want. 3 dots appeared. Then disappeared. No reply. As I started the engine, the silence felt different than it had in the motel room. Heavier. Earned. I realized something then that hadn't fully hit me before. Staying meant risk. Real risk. I might lose my son's patience trying to be present somewhere new. Or I might lose Susan's trust trying to fix what I'd already broken elsewhere. For the first time, I wasn't choosing between comfort and loneliness. I was choosing between two kinds of loss. And the unsettling part was this: I'd already made the choice. I didn't expect to be sitting in a school counselor's office at 55, staring at a poster that said positive choices lead to positive outcomes, wondering how I'd ended up there without actually belonging. The chair was too small. The desk was covered in neat stacks of paper that didn't concern me. And the thought that kept looping in my head wasn't about the kid or the meeting. It was this: I could still get up and leave. No one had asked me to be there. No one had told me to stay. I was present entirely by choice, and that made me uncomfortable. The counselor spoke carefully, the way people do when they've learned not to sound like they're taking sides. Attendance problems. Disruptions in class. A pattern that needed addressing. Then the phrase that stuck: a need for a stable adult presence. Susan nodded, hands folded in her lap so tightly her knuckles went pale. I watched her listen. Really listen. No excuses. No shifting blame. Just absorbing it like she'd done 100 times before. That was the first moment I understood how long she'd been carrying this on her own. The door opened again and Tom walked in. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He looked like a man who'd rushed straight from somewhere else and hadn't had time to prepare for this version of his day. Button-down shirt, work bag on one shoulder, tired eyes. He apologized for being late, sat down across from us, and folded his hands the same way Susan had. The symmetry of it hit me harder than it should have. They talked about their son like two people who had already replayed the same arguments privately and were now too tired to repeat them out loud. Missed mornings. Short tempers. Silence that lasted longer than it should. Tom admitted he was stretched thin. Work. His new family. Too many roles competing for the same hours. He didn't excuse it. He just said it. Then, without raising his voice, he looked at me. "This gets heavy," he said. "Heavier than you think it will." He didn't say it like a warning. He said it like a memory. I thought I could manage it all. I couldn't. And when I stepped back, it didn't just hurt once. It kept hurting. No one interrupted him. The counselor nodded slowly. Susan didn't look at either of us. I felt something old tighten in my chest. Because he wasn't describing a hypothetical future. I'd lived a version of it already. The meeting ended without solutions. Just follow-ups. More conversations. The kind of plans that sound responsible but don't promise relief. In the parking lot, Susan leaned against her car, keys clenched in her hand. She didn't look at me right away. "I understand if this is where you decide it's too much," she said. Her voice was steady. That made it worse. For a second, I was somewhere else, years back, standing in a different parking lot while my ex-wife asked me to sit down and look at numbers together because the business was slipping. I'd told her I had a contract out of state. That it was temporary. That I was fixing things. It had sounded logical at the time. It took years to admit I'd just been running from a conversation I didn't want. Standing there now, the same instinct flared. Say something kind. Step away clean. Don't create expectations you might fail to meet. I wasn't their father. I wasn't even officially part of their lives. Leaving now would hurt less than staying and disappointing them later. That argument had always been convincing. But another thought followed it, quieter and harder to shake. Every time I'd chosen the easier exit, I'd called it maturity. Timing. Responsibility. And every time, the distance I created never closed again. It just became permanent. I told Susan the truth. That I was scared of repeating my own history. That I knew exactly how to be helpful from the sidelines and vanish when things got complicated. I didn't promise anything. I didn't say I could fix this. I just said I didn't want to disappear without saying why. She listened, then nodded once. I don't need someone to save us, she said. I need someone who won't fade out when it stops being manageable. That night, my phone buzzed with a message from my son. Did you mean what you said? I stared at it, thumb hovering. Answering meant stepping back into a relationship I'd already damaged. Ignoring it would have been easier. I typed, erased, typed again. Finally, I sent the truth. Yes. I did. And I know I've given you reasons not to believe me. The dots appeared. Then nothing. An hour later, Susan called. Her voice was quieter than usual. I need to tell you something before you hear it another way. She paused. My son doesn't want you around anymore. He said you'll leave eventually, and he doesn't want to get used to you first. She wasn't angry. She wasn't asking me to argue with him. She was setting a boundary. It landed like a door closing. Not slammed. Just shut. I sat there long after the call ended, phone dark in my hand, realizing I'd already lost something. Not dramatically. Not loudly. But enough to feel it. Staying hadn't brought me closer yet. It had cost me access. Trust. Whatever fragile ground I'd just stepped onto. The next morning, I didn't drive to Susan's house. I didn't text her son. I didn't insert myself where I wasn't wanted. I sent Susan one short message instead. I'm here. Not pushing. Not gone. She didn't reply right away. By the time my phone finally buzzed, the sun was already low. Her message was brief. I need some space. I don't know for how long. I stared at those words until they blurred. This wasn't a pause I'd chosen. This wasn't distance I could control. For the first time, staying meant being pushed to the edge and told to wait. No reassurance. No timeline. Just the risk that this might already be the end. And that's when it became clear. I hadn't just stepped into something complicated. I'd stepped into something that could walk away without me. Episode 4 wouldn't be about whether I stayed or left. It would be about whether I could stand still without disappearing, when the choice was taken out of my hands. I found the envelope on my kitchen table when I got home, sitting where my keys usually landed. White. Plain. My son's handwriting on the front. No return address, like he wasn't sure he wanted it coming back. For a full minute, I didn't touch it. I stood there with my coat still on, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, already knowing that whatever was inside would cost me something. At 55, you learn that letters don't show up like that unless they mean to change your day. Or your direction. Inside was a printed flyer. A school schedule. A note folded once, careful, restrained. Dad. I'm moving in 2 weeks. New job. Different city. I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure you'd care. You said you were here. If you meant it, now's the time. That was it. No anger. No accusations. Just a door cracked open, narrow enough to miss if you weren't paying attention. I sat down slowly, the paper shaking in my hand, and felt the weight of a choice settle into my chest. This wasn't a conversation I could postpone. This was the price for all the times I had. Susan hadn't texted in days. No updates. No soft check-ins. Just silence. The kind that isn't cruel but isn't kind either. The kind that forces you to live with your thoughts. I'd told myself I was respecting her space. The truth was more complicated. I was afraid that if I reached out, I'd hear something final. And I wasn't ready to lose that on top of everything else. So I stood there in my kitchen, holding my son's note, realizing that staying present in one place might mean disappearing from another. Again. I drove to Susan's house that afternoon without texting first, then parked 2 houses down and sat there like an idiot, hands on the steering wheel. I didn't go up to the door. I didn't ring the bell. Her porch light was off. Her car wasn't there. I told myself I wasn't pushing. I was waiting. But even waiting has a cost. You just don't get to choose when it's collected. That night, my son called. No warning. Just his name lighting up my phone. I answered on the second ring, heart beating harder than it should have. He didn't ease into it. He never had. He told me about the job, the city, the timing. He said he needed help moving. Boxes. Paperwork. A couple of long days. I didn't ask before, he said. Because you usually have somewhere else to be. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. I just said I'd be there. And for the first time in a long while, he paused before responding. Okay, he said. Then be here. That was the moment the cost became clear. Being there meant leaving town. Leaving meant missing whatever fragile window Susan might still be holding open. There was no version where I did both. I hung up the phone and sat in the dark, feeling the familiar urge to split the difference. To promise everyone something and hope it worked out. But I'd learned where that road ended. Alone. Explaining. Again. I texted Susan. One sentence. No excuses. I need to go help my son move. I don't know what this means for us, but I didn't want to disappear without saying why. I stared at the screen after sending it, bracing for silence or something sharper. Her reply came an hour later. Thank you for telling me. Take care of him. No warmth. No invitation. Just acknowledgement. It felt like standing outside in the cold without knowing if there was still a house behind the door. The next 2 weeks were all boxes and early mornings. My son didn't make it easy. He tested me without meaning to. Asked for help, then watched to see if I'd follow through. I stayed. Even when I was tired. Even when I wanted to drive back and check my phone every 10 minutes. I stayed. On the last day, as we loaded the final box, he handed me a spare key to his new place. In case, he said, like it didn't matter. It did. That key weighed more than anything else in my pocket. When I finally drove back, Susan's street looked the same. Same trees. Same quiet. But I wasn't. I texted her from the car. Not asking. Telling. I'm back. If you're willing, I'd like to talk. She didn't respond right away. When she did, it was short. Come by tomorrow. We need to be clear. That word stuck with me all night. Clear meant honest. Honest meant there would be a price either way. She opened the door the next day and didn't smile. Not cold. Just guarded. We sat at the kitchen table like two adults who'd learned not to rush moments like this. I told her where I'd been. Why I'd gone. What it cost me to leave. What it would have cost me more if I hadn't. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she nodded slowly. I believe you, she said. But my son doesn't. And I won't force him to. There it was. The price. I could be back in her life. Just not in her house. Not yet. Not without earning ground inch by inch. I walked out an hour later without a hug, without certainty. But I also didn't walk out empty-handed. I'd chosen. And this time, the choice didn't end with me disappearing. It ended with me standing in the open, paying for presence with patience, knowing the return, if it came at all, would be slower, heavier, and real. I woke up earlier than I needed to on Sunday, the way you do when something important is coming and your body doesn't trust sleep with it. The house was quiet. Too quiet. No television hum, no traffic yet, just the low ticking of the kitchen clock that suddenly felt louder than it ever had. I stood there with a mug of coffee going cold in my hands and realized this was the first morning in weeks where nothing was demanding an answer from me. No messages. No deadlines. No decisions already made for me. And that should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like the moment before a verdict. Susan had texted the night before. Just one line. If you want to come by tomorrow morning, we should talk. No warmth. No distance either. Just an opening. Or a closing. With her, I'd learned that clarity didn't always mean comfort. Sometimes it just meant there was no place left to hide. I sat at the table longer than necessary, staring at the steam rising off the mug, knowing that whatever happened next would be shaped by what I said, and what I didn't. I drove over without rehearsing anything. That was new for me. I used to plan conversations the way I planned jobs, mapping exits before I even arrived. Her street looked familiar now, but my stomach still tightened when I parked. I noticed the small things while I waited. A cracked edge on the sidewalk. Leaves collecting near the curb. Signs of a life lived steadily, not dramatically. When she opened the door, she stepped back without smiling, but she didn't close it either. That felt like permission enough. Her kids were already awake. Not in the room with us, but close enough to hear movement. Cereal bowls. A cupboard closing. The ordinary sounds of a Sunday morning that somehow carried more weight than raised voices ever could. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one we'd used before, but this time there was no pretending it was casual. No coffee-first conversation. She looked at me for a long second before speaking, like she was measuring something internally. "I need to know what this is," she said. Not in big words. In real ones. That landed harder than any ultimatum. Because big words had always been easy for me. Real ones meant limits. Consequences. I told her the truth, stripped of the parts that made me look better. I told her I didn't want to replace anyone, didn't want to fix her life or her kids. I told her I wasn't here for a second chance at being a hero. I was here because I knew exactly what it cost to walk away from something hard and pretend it was wisdom. And I wasn't willing to do that again. She didn't respond right away. Her son walked through the kitchen, glanced at me, then looked away. Not hostile. Just guarded. That stung more than anger would have. Susan watched him go, then looked back at me. "I believe you," she said quietly. But belief isn't the same as trust. And trust isn't something I can give you on their behalf. That was the price. Not rejection. Not acceptance. A narrower road. She explained it plainly. I could be in her life. Slowly. Carefully. But I wouldn't be part of their routine yet. No dinners. No school events. No quiet role that looked like permanence before it earned it. She wasn't punishing me. She was protecting them. And if I stayed, I'd have to live with that boundary without pushing against it. I felt the old instinct rise then. The part of me that hates half steps. The part that wants either full commitment or a clean exit. This space in between had always made me restless. I could hear my own voice in my head, the one that said, "This is too much effort for too little certainty. You could leave now and still feel justified." For a moment, I wanted to say something final. Something that turned this into an ending instead of a test. But another thought followed. Quieter. Clearer. Every time I demanded clarity up front, I'd been asking for guarantees life never actually gives. I looked at Susan and realized she wasn't asking me to wait because she was unsure of me. She was asking me to wait because she'd learned what rushing costs. Saying yes to this meant accepting that love, at this stage of life, sometimes looks like restraint instead of intensity. I can do that, I said. My voice didn't sound confident. It sounded steady. I won't pretend it's easy. But I can do it. Her daughter appeared in the doorway then, backpack slung over one shoulder, watching us without hiding it. "Mom," she said, "are we still going later?" Susan nodded. The girl looked at me again, just for a second, then said, "Okay," and left. It wasn't approval. It wasn't dismissal. It was something in between. And I understood that, for now, that was as much as I was going to get. I left a little while later. No hug. No promise of when I'd be back. Just a quiet understanding that this wasn't over, but it wasn't settled either. As I drove away, my phone buzzed. A message from my son. "Move went fine. Place is quiet. Thanks for staying." That was all. No emotion attached. But I pulled over anyway, resting my forehead against the steering wheel, feeling something loosen that I hadn't known was still knotted. That afternoon, I went home and did something small but deliberate. I cleared out a drawer I'd been using to stash things temporarily. Old papers. Half-used notebooks. Stuff I never unpacked because I never planned to stay long. I made space without knowing exactly what would fill it. That felt right. Later, Susan texted. Just a photo. Her kitchen table in the evening light. 2 mugs. 1 empty chair. No caption. I didn't rush to interpret it. I just saved it. I don't know what the future holds for us. Anyone who tells you they do at this age is lying or selling something. What I do know is this: I didn't leave when staying cost me comfort. I didn't demand more than was offered. And for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't measuring success by how quickly things became easy. I was measuring it by how long I was willing to remain present when they didn't. If this story ends here, it ends honestly. Not with a promise. Not with a rescue. But with a man who finally learned that love, when it's real and late and earned, doesn't ask you to run faster. It asks you to stay slower.